There is a particular kind of cruelty that wears a smile. It does not slap you across the face. It does not scream or throw things or leave marks you can point to. It simply hands you a candle and then lights every chandelier in the house for someone else. It smiles while it does it. It calls you darling. It seats you at the wrong end of the table and asks if you are comfortable, and when you say yes, it nods and turns away and forgets you exist entirely. Lady Eleanor Voss lived inside that cruelty for 5 years. She was given the smallest room in a house her grandfather had built. She was given the coldest seat at a table her father had sat at every evening of his life. She was given a monthly allowance thin enough to see through and a smile so sweet it could rot your teeth. She never fought back. She never wept where anyone could see her. She never begged. She simply watched and waited and learned, and when the time finally came, she didn't burn anything down. She didn't stand in a doorway and deliver a speech. She simply left. And what happened after she left was the most devastating thing anyone in that county had ever witnessed. Eleanor was 22 years old when her father died. He went quietly, in his sleep, in the great oak bed he had slept in for 40 years. The kind of death that feels almost merciful, soft and private and dignified, until the morning after, when everything that was soft and private and dignified was stripped away in the space of a single afternoon. That was when Lady Cecily arrived, not as a guest, not as a mourner, as a wife. Lord Voss, it turned out, had remarried 18 months prior. Quietly, in a small chapel in Bath, without telling his daughter, without changing his will in any meaningful way, without doing a single thing to protect the girl he had always claimed to love, above everything in the world. Eleanor stood in the entrance hall of Voss Manor, her father not yet 3 days in the ground, and watched a woman she had never once met walk through the front door as though she had always owned it. Because, as Mr. Potts the solicitor would confirm that same afternoon, with his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, she did. Cecily Voss was 40 years old and magnificent in the way of women who have spent their entire lives carefully weaponizing their beauty. She wore deep burgundy silk even to a house in mourning. Her 2 daughters, Marianne and Priscilla, followed behind her like well-dressed shadows, their eyes moving across the rooms with the quick, assessing glances of people taking inventory. They looked at Eleanor the way you look at furniture you have already decided to replace, politely, briefly, without any real interest. "My condolences, darling," Cecily said. She did not sound sorry. She sounded like a woman who had already moved on to the next item on a very long list. The solicitor read the terms that afternoon. The estate passed entirely to Lady Cecily. Eleanor received a monthly allowance, enough to eat, not quite enough to leave. She had no dowry saved, no relatives willing to absorb another mouth, no option that did not end in either a desperate marriage or something far worse. So Eleanor stayed. But she did not stay the way Cecily expected her to stay. Cecily expected tears. She expected the kind of performance that comes from a young woman who has just had the floor pulled out from under her life. The tantrums, the locked doors, the red eyes at breakfast, the dramatic grieving that would make Cecily feel powerful and Eleanor feel small. She was entirely unprepared for Eleanor's silence. Eleanor moved into the smallest room without a single word of complaint. The north-facing room, the one that never caught the morning light, the one the housemaids had been using to store the winter linens. She folded her dresses neatly into the narrow wardrobe, placed her mother's portrait on the windowsill where the gray light would still reach it, and sat down on the edge of the narrow bed and listened to the house settle around her. At dinner that first evening, Cecily seated her below the salt, the worst seat at the table, the one reserved historically for guests of no consequence, for distant relations nobody quite wanted to claim, for people the host needed to accommodate but did not need to impress. Eleanor sat in it without comment. She ate her soup. She kept her eyes low and her ears open, and she began, quietly and methodically, to learn everything there was to know about the world she was now living inside. She learned that the head housekeeper, Mrs. Dowd, had worked for the Voss family for 30 years and regarded Lady Cecily with a barely concealed contempt that she expressed exclusively through the precision of her silences. She learned that the tenant farmers in the lower valley were 3 months behind on their rent payments, not because they were struggling, but because Cecily's newly appointed steward was intercepting the difference and recording it as losses from poor harvests. She learned that the family solicitor in the village, a weathered old man named Mr. Hale, had been her father's closest friend for the better part of 4 decades and had wept openly at the graveside while Cecily stood dry-eyed and composed beside him. Eleanor learned all of this by saying almost nothing and listening to absolutely everything. She was very good at both. In the first month, Cecily handed Eleanor the household accounts almost as an afterthought, the way you give a restless child something to occupy their hands. She did not want to be bothered with columns of numbers. She had curtains to replace, and furniture to rearrange, and a house to remake in her own image. She handed Eleanor the ledgers and went back to her redecorating, and did not think about it again. She did not realize she had just handed Eleanor the complete architectural blueprint of the estate's finances. Every debt, every income stream, every arrangement her father had made with every merchant and farmer and tradesman in the county. Eleanor read every page twice. She made notes in a small leather book she kept locked in the drawer of her narrow desk. She said nothing about what she found. In the 3rd month, she found the discrepancy. The steward had been skimming the tenant rents since his first week in the position. £17 missing from October, 22 from November. Small enough to stay hidden inside a large ledger, large enough to accumulate into something serious over time. Eleanor did not bring it to Cecily. She wrote a careful, precise letter to Mr. Hale instead, laying out the figures, attaching the relevant pages, and asking for his quiet counsel. Mr. Hale wrote back within 2 days. His handwriting was shaky with age, but his words were entirely steady. He told her he was glad she had written. He told her to keep writing. In the 6th month, Mrs. Dowd came to Eleanor's small, cold room late on a Tuesday evening. She brought tea that nobody had asked her to make. She sat down in the single wooden chair without waiting to be invited. She looked at Eleanor for a long moment with the expression of a woman who has been waiting a very long time to say something important, and then she said 7 words that changed the entire shape of the next 4 years. She said, "Tell me what you need, my lady." Eleanor looked at the old housekeeper. She looked at the narrow walls of her borrowed room, and the gray light falling across her mother's portrait, and the locked leather book in the desk drawer. Then she poured them both a cup of tea, and she began to talk. By the end of the 1st year, Eleanor knew every secret the estate contained. She knew which tenant families were loyal, and which were merely compliant. She knew which merchants would follow a fair arrangement, and which ones had been padding their invoices for years. She knew exactly how much the house cost to run, down to the last candle and the last sack of coal, and she knew exactly how much Cecily was spending beyond that figure every single month on things the estate could not sustain. She knew the shape of the trap Cecily was building, without knowing she was building it, and she said nothing. She sat below the salt at every dinner. She smiled when spoken to. She made herself as forgettable as possible and worked in the quiet hours when the house was dark and no one was paying attention. In the 2nd year, Eleanor quietly renegotiated the tenant leases in the Lower Valley. She did it through Mr. Hale, using his name and his signature, setting terms that were fair and transparent and that replaced the arrangement the dishonest steward had been exploiting. The tenant farmers met with Mr. Hale and shook his hand and went home satisfied. They did not know it was Eleanor who had drawn up every clause. They knew only that someone had finally treated them as though their labor mattered. That knowledge settled into them like a root and grew something Eleanor would need later. In the 3rd year, the steward was dismissed. Cecily believed it was her own decision, the result of a complaint she vaguely recalled receiving from someone or other about some matter involving the quarterly accounts. It was not her decision. Eleanor had written 4 separate letters to 4 separate people over the course of 6 months, each one arriving at the right desk at the right moment, each one adding one more thread to a web Cecily could not see because she had never once thought to look. The steward was gone within a fortnight, and Cecily hired a replacement and moved on entirely, satisfied with herself. In the 4th year, Marianne married a baron from Northumberland. It was considered an excellent match. Eleanor attended the wedding breakfast and sat at the far end of the table, as she always did, and she smiled warmly at the new couple and raised her glass with everyone else and said all the appropriate things. She had already quietly ensured, through a chain of introductions and favors so carefully constructed it was invisible, that the Baron's primary solicitor was a man who owed Mr. Hale a significant professional debt. She was thinking years ahead. Everyone else was thinking about the wedding cake. In the 5th year, Priscilla announced her engagement to a viscount. Cecily hosted a dinner for 30 guests to celebrate. She used the finest silver and opened the best wine from the cellar and wore a gown that cost more than Eleanor's entire quarterly allowance. The house looked magnificent. The candles blazed in every room. Cecily stood at the top of the staircase before the guests arrived and surveyed her domain with the deep satisfaction of a woman who believed she had won. Eleanor sat below the salt. She ate her soup. She looked for the last time at her mother's portrait hanging above the fireplace. The portrait Cecily had moved from the great hall to the dining room 6 months after arriving, because she said it was a little dark for the entrance. Eleanor looked at her mother's painted eyes for a long moment. Then she folded her hands in her lap and thought one single word to herself: tomorrow. She left before sunrise. There was no dramatic farewell, and no tears on the front steps, and no final confrontation in the great hall. There was a small leather trunk packed the night before. There was her mother's portrait rolled carefully in brown paper under her arm. There was a single letter left on the desk in the cold north room, 4 sentences long, written in Eleanor's neat and even hand. Then there was the sound of a carriage on the gravel drive in the dark, and then silence, and then nothing. Cecily found the letter at 9:30, when Eleanor did not appear for breakfast. She read it standing in the doorway of the north room in her silk morning gown, one hand holding the paper and the other resting on the doorframe. The letter said, "Dear Lady Cecily, I am leaving. I have taken only what was mine. I hope you enjoy the house." Cecily laughed. She laughed genuinely and with relief, the way you laugh when a problem you have quietly endured for years has finally resolved itself without requiring anything of you. She called for Mrs. Dowd to have the room cleared and made ready for use by noon. Mrs. Dowd did not answer. Cecily rang the bell in the hallway. Silence. She walked to the top of the staircase and called down into the entrance hall. Nothing came back but her own voice and the echo of the high ceiling. She descended the stairs and walked into the kitchen. The fire was cold. The room was empty. Every surface was clean and bare, and still in the way of a room that has been deliberately and carefully left, rather than simply abandoned for the morning. She walked into the yard. The head groom was gone. The undergroom was gone. Every stable hand whose name she could recall, and several whose names she had never learned, were gone. She stood in the empty yard in her silk morning gown and looked at the open stable doors and the quiet, and felt, for the first time, the specific cold that lives inside a large house when all the warmth has walked out of it. She went back inside and moved through the rooms one by one. The parlor, the library, the scullery, the laundry room, the servants' quarters at the back of the house where every bed was neatly made, and every cupboard emptied with a careful thoroughness that spoke not of haste but of planning. Gone. Every single person who had been part of the household before Cecily arrived. Every person who had watched Eleanor sit below the salt for 5 years and said nothing and waited. Every person who had been treated fairly and spoken to with quiet respect by a girl Cecily had dismissed as defeated. They had not left in the night. They had arranged it over months, each one giving their notice through the proper channels, each one departing within the same 2-day window, each one leaving their quarters in perfect order because Eleanor had asked them to leave things well. By the afternoon, the first letter arrived from the lower valley. Thomas Harding, the eldest of the tenant farmers, wrote to inform Lady Cecily that per the updated lease agreement, signed 18 months prior, his quarterly payments would henceforth be directed to a new account held in the name of Miss Eleanor Voss, administered by Mr. Hale of the village. He thanked her for her time and remained her obedient servant. By evening, 2 more letters had arrived with identical information. By the end of the week, there were 14. Cecily sat alone in the great hall, with the letters spread across the table in front of her. The fire had gone out because no one had laid it. The dinner silver from the engagement celebration was still arranged on the sideboard because no one had cleared it. The house was entirely, profoundly, unnervingly quiet, in a way that no house that size should ever be quiet. She picked up Eleanor's letter again. She read it a second time, and then a third. I have taken only what was mine." She looked around the great hall at the fine wallpaper and the expensive carpets and the portraits on the walls. Everything was exactly where it had always been. The house was intact. The building was standing. Nothing had been damaged or removed or destroyed. She looked at the wall above the fireplace, at the space beside her own portrait, at the long rectangular outline in the wallpaper, slightly darker than the surrounding paint, the ghost of a frame that had hung in that spot for 20 years before Cecily had moved it to the dining room because it was a little dark for the entrance. Eleanor had taken it when she left. She had taken her mother's portrait and her locked leather notebook and a small trunk of clothing, and nothing else. And somehow, in the mathematics of what remained, that felt like the most complete and total removal of all. Cecily understood it then. Not all at once. In pieces, the way understanding arrives when it has been kept waiting too long. Eleanor had never been the defeated girl sitting quietly at the wrong end of the table. She had been the person who knew where every foundation stone was buried. She had been the one who kept the accounts honest, the tenants loyal, the staff steady, the arrangements functional. She had not been enduring the house. She had been holding it together from the inside, invisibly, the way mortar holds stone, the way roots hold soil, the way all the things you cannot see are the only things that actually matter. The grand rooms were still there. The carpets, the portraits, the silver on the sideboard, the chandeliers Cecily had been so pleased to light. But a house without the people who know how to care for it is not a house. It is a very large and very cold collection of rooms. And a woman who spent 5 years handing someone a candle while she lit every chandelier for herself had just discovered what happens when the person holding the candle decides she would rather take her light somewhere else. Eleanor did not ride into the sunset. She did not arrive somewhere new and immediately triumph. She rented 2 modest rooms in the village, with the first payment from the tenant leases, and sat at a small desk by a window that caught the morning light, and opened her locked leather notebook and began to plan the next chapter, with the same patience and the same precision she had used to write the last one. On the windowsill beside her, in a square of early sun, her mother's portrait looked out at the day. Eleanor looked at it for a moment. Then she dipped her pen and went to work. Some people fight back loudly. They shout and confront and demand and make sure that everyone in the room knows they have been wronged. There is a satisfaction in that. But there is a different kind of satisfaction, rarer and deeper and far more complete, in the revenge that is built in silence over years, the kind that requires patience instead of anger, strategy instead of performance, and the absolute unshakable knowledge that you are not the one who is losing, even when everyone in the room is certain that you are. Eleanor Voss knew that. She knew it from the first night she spent in the cold north room. She knew it every time she sat below the salt. She was never waiting to be rescued. She was waiting for the right moment to stop holding up a house that had never deserved her. And when that moment came, she simply walked out the door and let it fall. If you want more stories about quiet women who win loudly, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you never miss one. Leave a comment below and tell me the moment you realized Eleanor was never the victim. I will see you in the next one.